one particular map in particular, which really, really kind of gives a sense of power towards me, is something called bombshell reports. So can you tell me a little bit about how that speaks to you as a map of not power, but also it speaks as a map of showing power through time, perhaps, because maps are a static thing, it seems like, but actually they can be a temporal measure as well.
Yeah. So bombshell reports is something, I'll just turn to the page now, but it started off as a story about the US bombing of Vietnam. So there's this historic data set that actually spans every war since the First World War, which is shows historic sorties, they're called, but missions that US Air Force planes flew. And they used to be marked on paper maps. It used to be that, the pilots would come back and mark on the map where they'd been and what their target was. And then these data sets got digitized. So actually they became a digital resource. And they were still classified in the most part. But actually in the year 2000, Bill Clinton released the classified information for the Vietnam War. And the reason he did this was because the US actually had a secret bombing campaign of Cambodia. Now, obviously, the people in Cambodia were aware of it because they've been suffering the consequences since through unexploded bombs that have been killing and injuring people for the decades since the war. But the kind of US population, it was considered a state secret that this bombing ever happened. And so the data got released in order to help people locate where the most intensive bombing happened, and so that they could then go and search for the unexploded ordnance. Right. And it was a real surprise to me because I hadn't heard about this Cambodia bombing. So when I first opened the data set, I could see that there was all this bombing in Cambodia. And so the job became, how do we tell that story in such a way that people can relate the data points, the dots, to the missions and the things that were happening at the time. And so we had to do a huge amount of research to understand how the data was structured, even what the different missions were. It's called Operation Menu, they're sort of named after meals. And so the power of the map, and actually we actually make a bigger one here, fold it out, so that we can mark on it where the different bombs fell, depending on these missions. So we had breakfast, dinner, dessert, snack, supper, were these missions along particular roads that the US Army were targeting. And so actually we combined that story with another story which is about a siege that happened to US troops within Vietnam, Battle of Khe Sanh, which is this celebrated, for want of a better word, battle within US military history where this US base was under siege. And it turned out that around that base became the most heavily bombed part on the planet. And so we had a challenge. We had to come up with a way of telling a story over a longer time period across a whole country. And then people can turn the page, and then we had to zoom right into a specific event and add narration and things like that to help tell that story. And so there's a big kind of iceberg of work that went into this. And the trick is using things like arrows and annotation to help pull out what's happening.
Yeah, and it's really, really interesting how you've gone about mapping this, because as we said, this is really a map, a temporal map, as well as a geolocation spatial map. So, for example, I took a little bit of naming bombing campaigns after snacks, after meals. That in itself, displaying that, almost the inhumanity of it. But of course, going on it completely now analytical in terms of a temporal scale, they are temporal time stamps, aren't they? They're breakfast, and then depending on, some people say dinner and supper, whatever way around, but then you've got the temporal according to those campaigns there. And then the way that you've done this in terms of your geolocation points, you've got Operation Menu, which you've done in yellow, which was the campaign in 1969 to 1970, then Operation Freedom Deal, you've got that in orange, and you've got that in red. And of course, as you've just already mentioned, you've got that zoomed in function where you've got you know, you've done the same sort of thing where you've done it by month and
Yeah.
gone really. So you've not just zoomed in spatially, you've zoomed in temporally as well. So explain to me why you decided to go about it.
Yeah,
that
well,
way.
that was one of the big kind of features of one of the big not features, but one of the biggest kind of revelations was that we originally had our points coloured by time in a generic sense, you know, between January and March, you know, March to May and so on. But then Oliver, who designed the book as the co-author, he said, well, look, the trouble is the colours of your points are not lining up with these key moments in the campaign. So what you need to do is you've got to go back and you've got to recolour all of them to fit these distinctive moments in the history. And then as soon as you do that, the picture emerges. And so it's a good example of where thinking about how you can use colour, you know, goes beyond just saying, well, these are sort of, you know, equal time periods that we're going to use colour for the particular points. Is actually using the colour to help really tell that story.
And that's one thing that I noticed actually is that in classic mapping, I guess, you've got very stratified data categorization. So you would have, you know, it's almost frowned upon that it must be 3 months, 3 months, 3 month segments or something like that. But yeah, absolutely, you've got it's purely to the narrative rather than to the temporal space.
Exactly
and
right.
you can quite clearly see from the map, you know, how the campaign switched from the east and then really did focus over towards, you know, the west along the river. So that's really, really powerful visualization in that respect.